University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, and my co-host is Kevin Erb with the Wisconsin Extension Service. If you haven't already, go to the Google folder that's linked there at z.umn.edu/ACPF handouts. You'll find the agenda there, and also download there's a link in the agenda to the user guide, and the toolkit practice is there in the session 1 folder. So those are the things you'll need for today. I want to start out with some acknowledgements. The development of this training curriculum has been led by the North Central Region Water Network, the Wisconsin Extension Service, and the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center. The funding for the development is from the USDA ARS, USDA NRCS, Iowa State University, and the Iowa Water Center, which are the home of the ACPF National Hub. And finally, the US EPA has provided past funding for the development of this training. We also rely on our state partners. So as you're watching these presentations, you're going to see the fingerprints of people from Ohio State, Michigan, Purdue, and state agency staff from Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So many thanks to their involvement. These sessions are being recorded, so if you have to miss a portion of them, we'll have those recordings available for a week or so you can catch up. Generally stay muted. There's a lot of people on this session, but we really encourage you to use the chat for questions and discussion. So we'll be using that quite a bit. If you have any technical questions, having difficulties with Zoom or whatever, Ann Nardi from the University of Wisconsin Extension is on, and she can help with that. And then finally the handouts, which I already mentioned. So we're going to spend about 5 or 6 hours together this week on this. So we'll be covering a lot of material. And by the end of Friday, here's what we're hoping you're going to come away with. We're hoping you have a good understanding of the value of the ACPF, when it's appropriate to use it, what it adds to your conservation work. We want you to be able to use the ACPF analysis and outputs as part of your farm scale or watershed scale planning and implementation. We're hoping this is not a GIS training. You're not going to come away with the ability to use the ACPF within ArcGIS. But on the other hand, there's really some technical concepts that it's important for you to get a handle on so that you understand the assumptions behind the ACPF outputs so you can explain them and use them correctly. We are hoping you will be able to prepare to engage with staff and stakeholders using the ACPF outputs. And we're hoping you'll have a plan for what your next steps are by the end of Friday. So that's where we're hoping to get. Today, we're going to start out jumping into the technical information. So that's what we'll focus on today. On Wednesday, we'll get into some in-depth case examples. So this is your chance to get into the messy, how does this actually work on the ground kind of questions. And then on Friday, we'll dig into the different ways that you can display and use the outputs, and how do you make choices between the different ways we package that. And we'll talk about some resources that you can access for using ACPF. And we'll get started planning so you can figure out how to use the ACPF. Here's who's in our room, in that if you haven't already filled out that introduction in your agenda, there's a link to this survey. But of the 37 or I think 38 people have responded so far, most of you, almost all of you, have little to just a basic understanding of what ACPF is, and that's perfect. That's what we're aiming this at. So that's good. The organizations who are here, local government, so conservation districts and similar kinds of organizations. private consultants and non-government organizations. There's quite a few of you in the room here. A lot of those are watershed organizations, so they're also working at a scale like the local governments. So that whole group of people working at local watersheds, that's who we're aiming this at as well. So then we have about 10 research people, a handful of federal government, mostly NRCS, but also USGS and EPA. And then a couple people from state, one from a state agency and one from a provincial agency. All right, I want to run through real quickly here that overview of ACPF that I think most of you have watched already, that video, which is linked in your agenda. It's about 20 minutes long, and I'm just going to quickly go through the key takeaways from there. So if you're not comfortable with any of these, I'd suggest you go back to that video and take a look at it. So the first takeaway, there's 4 input layers that are required to use this tool. The first is the field boundaries. The second is the 6 years of land use data. Each field is characterized by, is this corn beans rotation, or is this continuous corn, or is this does it have a perennial mixed in the rotation? So that's why we need 6 years of history there. There's the third layer is a subset of the Surgo soil data, and the fourth is elevation data, the digital elevation model. Those first 3 are available for the HUC-12s shown in this map. So you can download those easily at the HUC-12 scale. And the cool thing about these is these layers have a lot of applications beyond ACPF. So if we encourage you to find other ways to use these particular data sets that have been prepared. If you don't have them, there are utilities in the ACPF to help build those. So it's you can still develop that, but it'll take a little bit more effort. Right. Takeaway number 2, hydro modification of the DEM is critical to getting useful results, and it can be time consuming. Emily is going to talk more about this in a few minutes, so I'm not going to expand on this, but if this, make sure by the end of this that you have a good handle on what is hydro modification and what does it take to get a digital elevation model into the shape that it needs to be in. Number 3, the ACPF toolbox does terrain analysis. Now, what is terrain analysis? This is when the GIS will analyze the shape of the land to figure out where water flows. And if you think about how much of your conservation is a matter of controlling where water flows and how fast it's flowing, that's why this is the critical tool. There's a lot of watershed planning tools out there, but this is ACPF's superpower, that it really does this terrain analysis better than perhaps any other tool out there. GIS users have long been able to do terrain analysis in ArcGIS, but what's special about ACPF is that it semi-automates this whole process, and it does it in the context of NRCS practice standards. So that means it's paying attention to where the field boundaries are. It's paying attention to the constraints that NRCS standards put on where you can put a practice. Number 4, the ACPF produces or identifies sites where conservation practices will work and are appropriate. So this is just a menu of feasible options where they can be. This is not a prescription. To prioritize where you should actually be putting these practices, you need to bring in a lot of other information, including, are people interested in this? And are the practices already installed in these different places that are identified? So a lot of different factors to prioritize, and the ACPF is the beginning. Number 5, there's 2 basic ways to use the outputs from ACPF. One is behind the scenes, where as staff, you use it to prepare to go out in the field, and this makes your field visits much more efficient and effective. The second way to use it is as a tool for engagement. We found a lot of instances where by informing and bringing your stakeholders into the conversation, they can really help and inform you. If they understand what the options are, they can tell you, yes, this is feasible, this is a good way to approach this, this is what we're most interested in. So 2 basic ways to use it. And then the final takeaway is that ACPF is part of a watershed approach to conservation. And that means if you're working at a field scale, that still works. ACPF is still useful if you're thinking in a watershed framework. That is, if you're thinking about what's upstream from this field, what's downstream from this field, and how do they connect. The ACPF, this conservation pyramid, the foundation is the soil health in the fields, which ACPF does not really address. But for a watershed approach to conservation, you're thinking about that in-field management, you're thinking about the within-field management, you're thinking about the edge of field management of water, and you're thinking about the management of water right next to the streams and rivers. And so connecting all of those and addressing all of those together is what we mean by that. There was this great publication produced a few years ago, coming out of UW, called Successful Watershed Management in the Midwest, Getting to Scale. So if you're interested in more about watershed management, this course that we're presenting this week is not a watershed management training. However, it really relies on you having a sense of watershed management and what that takes. So if you want to learn more about watershed management, I really recommend this publication. In it, they take a look at how human capital, social capital, the policy framework, the finance framework, how all of these integrate at the watershed scale, and how you have to integrate from the smaller to the larger watersheds, and all of that. So check out that publication if you'd like more. So here's the outputs that ACPF can produce, and they break down into 4 different categories. The first group identifies the flow network. The second group identifies the field characteristics. Specifically, in this field, how steep or not steep is it? How likely is it to have tile drainage? How close is it to the stream? And when you combine that information, what's the risk of runoff for that field? The third group of outputs is an assessment of riparian areas. And the fourth group, this is the main core of ACPF, is siting practices. And these are the 9 practices that ACPF is designed to identify. All right, I am going to hand off to Emily here. I will give you this link at the end as well, and this link is in your on the agenda. If you have questions as you're listening to Emily that aren't getting answered, be sure you send them to us. We'll be sure to address them on Wednesday, or if you have any suggestions, we'll do that. All right, at this point, I will hand off to Emily. And Emily, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marcel. Just gonna get my screen on here. Okay, so my name is Emily Zimmerman, and I'm the Director of Agricultural Strategies for the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. I've been in this role for about 6 months now. Prior to this role, I was at Iowa State University, where I co-led the ACPF National Hub with Rick Cruz. I've been using the ACPF and conducting research with the tool and on the tool for about the past 10 years. So really have dedicated a lot of time to this tool and think it has a lot of potential to really help us innovate around conservation. In addition to working on the ACPF, My former research group also worked on understanding outcomes from these conservation scenarios, so thinking about nutrient reduction and costs. So I get the pleasure this afternoon of spending a little bit of time with this group talking about the technical information. I want to emphasize what Marcel said. This isn't sort of the deep dive for GIS analysts. It's just what we feel like is important for everybody to know who might use the ACPF. So we're going to kind of like fly over the technical details. I'm happy to answer technical questions, and certainly would welcome folks who have a technical interest to take the training more oriented to GIS folks. So just a brief overview of what we're gonna do this afternoon for the next hour and a half or so. I'm gonna very, very briefly, with just one slide, summarize what the ACPF is, and I'm gonna really focus on basically 4 important points that I think are really critical for understanding what the tool is and its potential. And then we're really going to focus on these 3 important reminders, and I'm going to do that by demoing some of the technical aspects of the tool. And then we're going to intercede that with answering some questions. And then I hope at the end that we have a little bit of time to have a discussion and answer questions. For the part where we're actually doing some practice together, I want to warn folks, I'm going to ask you to interact a little bit, both in the chat and by unmuting your microphone. So please be prepared for that. I think it's kind of fun to interact around these tools and to learn what everybody's thinking about. All right, so I'm going to start by just my one slide. Hopefully everyone had a chance to look at the preparatory materials, and Marcel did a really nice job of talking about this already. But basically my 4 important points about what the ACPF is. So it's a science-based, data-driven approach to planning. And that means planning at both the field, farm, and small watershed scale. And I think this approach of using science and data is really important because it helps us to ground the decision-making in really important information. You can see on the bottom of the slide that I've listed some references. That is not an all-inclusive list. There's been a lot of research both on the biophysical side and the tool itself, as well as on the social science side. So this is a tool that's been well researched and published. Then sort of the 3 things about ACPF. So it's going to identify opportunities not only for best management practices or conservation practices, but also where there might be resource concerns. So it really does address a number of the 9 steps of the conservation planning process sort of all in one. Marcel already talked a little bit about this, but the data sets that are available online with respect to field boundaries, watershed boundaries, soils, and crop and land use history are really useful to inform even just conversations with landowners about conservation. The tool, because it's spatially oriented, really recognizes that both farms and watersheds are unique and heterogeneous. And what that means is that each of those fields and farms and watersheds might have different resource concerns in different places. And that means that the best management practices that might be appropriate for those concerns are going to be different. So ultimately, what ACPF does is provide this really beautiful non-prescriptive approach for conservation planners, landowners, and farmers and other stakeholders about all of the potential opportunities that field, farm, or watershed might have. So it visualizes and provides all of that data behind that visualization for folks to start to interact and engage with conservation. All right, so now we're going to get sort of into the technical details. So for those of you who are familiar with ArcGIS Pro, this screenshot that I have probably looks familiar. For those of you who aren't, I'm going to sort of step through what you're looking at. So at the top of the screen, at the top of the screenshot, you can see the ACPF toolbox. So this is what it's going to look like in a GIS frame. And then you can see the 7 different tools that are present in the toolbox. And you can think about these tools, especially tools 1 through 6, as sort of steps. So you're going to move through them sequentially until you get to number 6. The first 2 steps are really the most important, in my opinion. That's where the terrain analysis or the digital elevation model preparation occurs, and then where we also develop our stream network. And like Marcel mentioned, a lot of our resource concerns are directly related to where water flows on the landscape. So in these first two steps, we ensure water is flowing down, and then we identify where it concentrates. And that really sets us up for success to understand what's happening in our fields, and then where there might be opportunities to place conservation practices. So I'm going to start by talking about these first two steps, the digital elevation model or DEM preparation, and then developing the stream network and catchments. And like I just mentioned, the goal of these two steps is to get water to flow down, which everyone, maybe folks who aren't GIS or terrain analysis friendly, that's kind of funny, right? Well, duh, we need to get water to flow down. But it's actually not that easy sometimes. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the hangups and the hiccups there and what is important to be aware of as either you or a GIS technician you're working with is going through that process. Then we want to identify where it concentrates into our stream networks and denote where that stream is perennial, meaning water's flowing year-round, versus ephemeral, where there might be more seasonal flow. That's going to be really important because that helps us to understand what conservation practices might be most appropriate in which places. So I want to start by just framing the elevation piece a little bit because I think a lot of us spend a decent amount of time looking at maps like the one that you see on the right side of your screen. This is a digital elevation model that's focused on Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. This was just a map that was on my screen a few weeks ago. We're doing some work in this region. So we've been spending quite a bit of time looking at the elevation of this particular area. And like I said, I think a lot of us look at these elevation models quite a bit, looking at elevation or topography. But I just want to frame for a minute the data that are actually behind these. So I have this grid in the upper left, and you can think about this grid as forming the basis for what you're looking at in this map. So each of these grid cells would have a linear area around it. So common linear areas for digital elevation models would be between 1 and 3 meters. So that would be between 1 and 3 meters on each one of these sides. And then each one of these squares is going to be assigned an elevation. And that elevation is going to be representative of that particular grid cell. And so that's what you actually see in this map is basically a visual representation of all of these different values of elevation. And the way that we collect this elevation data is often from satellite information. And then there's a lot of processing to get it to the point where it looks like this on my screen. And throughout that process, there are artifacts and errors that happen. And so one of the first steps in the ACPF, as we begin to think through terrain analysis, is to correct some of those errors. So this is the toolbox, this first toolbox that's associated with DEM preparation. And there are 5 sub-steps that the technician will go through in that first step. I just mentioned that there are anomalies or errors that happened during the data collection and processing of LiDAR data to a digital elevation model. One of the really common ones is that sometimes those individual grid cells either have an artificial sink or an artificial peak. And so this first process of the DEM preparation tool is going to fill those in. So that's going to be step 1 of this preparation. Step 2 is to start to think about where water's flowing on the landscape. So here's an elevation grid. So just like the one I talked about. So each of these unique values represent the elevation associated with that grid cell. And so what this means practically is that the grid cell with 78 in it, that grid cell is going to flow from its lower right-hand corner down into grid cell 67. Grid cell 67 is going to flow down its lower right-hand corner into grid cell 44. And all of those cells are going to move on down until they all accumulate in number 11, right? That's the lowest elevation that you see in this small grid. So 2 things happen during terrain processing here. We understand the directionality of the flow from each one of those cells, and we understand where water is accumulating or where flow is accumulating. So again, if we look at the cell with the lowest elevation, that's where all of the grid cells in this example are flowing. Everybody's flowing to 35. So the flow direction and the flow accumulation are really essential understanding where water is flowing across the landscape. And that happens in the second step of DEM processing. After those steps happen, we work to understand where there might be impeded flow. So those are areas where flow isn't leaving, it's concentrating. And so you can see that in this image on the left, where these blue pools occur. Those are areas where we have relatively closed depressions, or where we have large depressions. So you can see there's perhaps a wetland or a reservoir here that we're picking up. So we're looking for these areas of closed depression. And then we're also starting to move beyond just flow accumulation to really understanding where that pattern flow is on the landscape. So in this step, we're looking at all of the flow paths that are accumulating more than 5 acres. So this is taking sort of that rough raster and we're moving it into a flow path. Just going to look at the chat. Okay, so there's a question in the chat about which DEM is better to use and can the tool be used anywhere in the world? That's a great question. So in general, when we think about digital elevation models, we found that the sweet spot for this particular tool is somewhere between a resolution of 1 meter and 3 meters. So that's the really critical piece of information. Outside of that, the source or the type of DEM probably doesn't really matter. It's really that resolution that's critical. Again, between 1 meter and 3 meters seems to be sort of a sweet spot for the ACPF's analysis and processing time and things like that. Second question about being used anywhere in the world. So certainly you could use the terrain analysis step anywhere in the world if you so desired. I'm just thinking through the input data. As long as you had a digital elevation model, you could go through that step. And I'll just add that for the rest of the required input data, so that's the watershed boundary, the field boundaries, the land use and cropping history, and the soils information, at least for the United States, and actually abroad as well. I know there's someone from Canada joining us. And I know there's been some work in Canada to build out these data sets. If you have access to the data, the last toolbox in the ACPF tool that I showed, it basically will help you put together the geodatabase, put together the data, get the naming conventions correct so that you can build your own input data and run the tool. So certainly, I don't know if we've tried it all over the world. I think they're using it in New Zealand and in Canada, but the potential is there. It's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to come back to, we're talking about flow paths and flow patterns. So again, we just finished, I'm going to go back here, thinking about terrain processing, and we now know the direction and the accumulation. We need to understand where flow might be impeded, and we're going to visualize our flow lines. After that step, and this is where Marcel alluded to this, but this next step is really, really important. It's probably the most important step in the whole ACPF process, and it also takes the longest. And that's hydromodification of the digital elevation model. So most places where digital elevation models are available, there are areas of the watershed. So think about areas where there's infrastructure, so ditches, culverts, railroads, roads, bridges, interspersed urban centers. Those places all have infrastructure and built environment that influences where and how water flows. And sometimes that's not going to be picked up on by our digital elevation model. And so it's really important that a GIS analyst goes back through the flow paths and the impeded flow and identifies places where the model has it wrong. basically it's not crossing where we think it's going to cross the road, for example, or it's running along a ditch, and we know it doesn't run there. So this step is really, really important, and it can take anywhere from, I don't know, 6 hours to 30 hours for someone with GIS experience. And so I want to just show an example. So again, this image on the right, those are all of the flow paths. So where water is concentrating from an area of greater than 5 acres. And then this image sort of in the middle, that's the same watershed. And what you're seeing in red are cut lines. And so we are going to correct the digital elevation model in two ways, either by dropping the elevation and allowing water to flow where the model had it wrong, or by increasing the elevation with dam lines and basically impeding the flow of water where water had flown in the digital elevation model. So the two ways that the analyst can correct it, to drop the elevation to get water to flow, or increase the elevation to impede water from flowing where it was. And I have an example here on the far right-hand side of the slide from this particular watershed of a place where we had to work with cut lines. So the blue line, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's sort of where my cursor is. That's where the flow paths were. So you can think about this, the blue line being the same as the purple maroon line that's over in this map on the far left. And then you can see this is our depth to grid. So this is our impeded flow. This is that raster from the previous slide. And so the darker the blue, the deeper the grid. So that would indicate to us probably where the stream is moving. And so what I want to call your attention to are to two different places. So first is the first time that this crosses a road. So you can see that right here. And instead of following that depth grid down, we cut along this ditch and then drop down. And so right here is a culvert, and that culvert isn't being picked up correctly on the digital elevation model. So we need to go in, we make a small cut, and that cut drops the elevation and forces the flow to cross the road where it should. The same thing is happening on this lower side. You can actually see the culvert here. And so we need to get the water to cross that road. And so again, we'll use a cut line to drop the elevation and correct that flow. And you can see those cut lines delineated in red here and here. And so again, this process can take a long time. If you think about a HUC 12 watershed, somewhere between 25 and 40,000 acres, that's a lot of time that you spend sort of looking through the watershed to see where these opportunities might be. Depending on the state you're in and the kind of data you have, you may have access to a layer of infrastructure, of culverts, of railroads, of roads. Having those data on your screen can help you do this process a lot faster, and is an important thing to encourage a GIS analyst to do. So this particular watershed is in Iowa, and so I always like to draw folks' attention. If you look at where I've had, and I actually was the one who corrected this watershed, if you look at where I've had to make my my cuts and my dams here, in this case I'm just showing cuts, what you'll realize is that it mostly follows section lines. So a lot of the corrections are around roads and culverts, some railroads as well, but a lot around roads. So having that road later on can be really important. Okay, so what I realized though is that many of you are not the analysts who are going to actually run the ACPF. The reason why I want to emphasize this is for basically two reasons. It's really important that when you're working with your GIS analyst, that you reinforce the need to go through the hydro modification process. Because if you don't, the flow isn't going to be accurate, and it's going to impact the placement of resource or the identification of resource concerns and the placement of potential best management practices. So this step is really critical, and it's really important to underscore the value of taking time here. The second piece I want to emphasize is that this might be a good spot for you to have a conversation with the analyst. Basically review this together. Where are those spots that you as the resource or conservation professional know there's a culvert or know there's a reservoir or a dam or that there's impeded flow? And then finally, recognize that this takes a lot of time. So if you're waiting on the analysts to get through this step, recognize that it might take some time to get through. So I really want to emphasize this step is really critical, and it takes time. Okay, so toolbox number two. Now we're moving on. We've got water flowing down. We feel confident in our flow lines. Okay, so I've got a question, Mitch. Are flow paths derived after cut lines are identified? Okay, yes. So there, it's basically a two-step process. So let me go back. So one of the steps in DEM prep is to derive these area threshold flow paths. And so the user can decide, it can be anywhere from, I think, like one acre flow paths all the way up to 10. So you get to decide kind of the density that you want to look at. But this is basically a tool to help you understand where there might be challenges with respect to modification. In this second toolbox, that's when you actually are going to develop the flow paths or the flow network. Essentially an iterative process. The first flow paths are really to help you understand where there might be impediments or where you might need to do some hydro modification. And then the second step is really to get that perennial stream network and the flow paths correct. So it's sort of a two-step process. Okay, so toolbox number two. This is where we're going to develop our stream network encatchments. The thing I always like to lead with here is that one really important piece of ACPF is that we don't use NHD lines. We use the digital elevation model that you have selected as a user to derive our flow paths. So if you were to put NHD lines over the top, National Hydrographic Data Set lines over the top, they wouldn't necessarily match what the stream network encatchments look like from ACPF. So I think that's important. There's all kind of reasons why we do that, but it's critical at this. We feel like it's critical at this resolution to really match that digital elevation model with the flow paths that are generated. Oh, does someone have a question? Oh, I must have just got some background noise. Okay. So the first step is we're going to create our pour points, and then we're going to go through flow network definition. So that'll look a lot like that past image that I showed. You'll see that pretty sort of branched flow path come through. But then this part C, the stream reach encatchments, this is the most important part of this toolbox. So what the GIS analyst is going to have to do is look at every single segment of the stream that was identified, and then delineate which segments of that stream network are perennial and which stream segments are ephemeral. You can also make them more fancy if you want, but really the important part is just which are flowing all year and which are much more intermittent or ephemeral. And so to do that, that's again a manual process that person has to undertake. And this again is another critical juncture if you're not doing the GIS work yourself. As a resource professional who's familiar with that watershed, it's probably important for you to have a conversation with the analyst and just double check some of the decisions that were made about whether that stream network was ephemeral or perennial. This is really critical because some practices in the ACPF are only suitable for perennial streams. So making sure we get this right is a critical step. All right, so I have a couple takeaways before we do the first two questions of the practice. So DEM preparation and delineation of stream networks and catchments, these two steps are absolutely foundational for success in identifying areas of resource concern and opportunities for practices. And they rely really heavily on an elevation model and on a GIS analyst that's comfortable with that elevation model. And again, there are really key times in the process, and I tried to touch on that as I was talking there, namely where we're hydromodifying and correcting flow, and where we're identifying perennial and ephemeral streams, when making sure that it's not only the GIS text knowledge, but also the knowledge of the local landscape that are really informing each other, so that water is flowing in the right places on the landscape at the right time. And so I think it's important to provide support to GIS technicians. So I just as this process would happen, check in, make sure that those conversations are happening between a GIS technician and the local resource professional if that's not the same person. That having that knowledge of the local landscape and its biophysical characteristics is really going to enhance results that you'll use on down the line. All right, so with that, what I'm going to ask is that we take a pause, and I'm going to give you about, I don't know, 7 minutes or so. Um, okay, I got one more. Oh, perfect. Marcel's got it in there. So the link that Marcel just put in the chat, the practice worksheet, if everyone would go ahead and open up that practice worksheet, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If everyone would go ahead and open up that practice worksheet. And what you'll see when you open it up is practice questions. And what I'd like you to take about 7 minutes to do is respond to questions number 1 and number 2. And so we'll come back together at about 1:50. And when we do that, I'm going to ask folks to respond to some questions, um, and maybe come off mute and share their responses. So we'll go ahead and work on those questions until about 1:50. And if you have any questions as you do that, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'm happy to respond to those.
I'll jump in here, Emily, and say that in the past, we've had a few folks that have wanted to take some of this time and actually print them so they can look at them on paper instead of on a screen. So feel free to go ahead and do that if that's easier for you as well.
Okay, so wherever you are at, I'm going to ask you to wrap up. Okay, and there is a question in the chat. Ha! Okay, so a conversation in the chat. I love it. Okay, so Mitch asked how the ACPF defines perennial, and Ethan responded that the ACPF doesn't do that, the tech does it. And that's 100% correct. So that's again, I want to just encourage everybody if you're if you're not the person who's doing the GIS analysis using ACPF, having conversations about what it means to be perennial and ephemeral is really important. In general, um, I would say that when you think about ACPF and what perenniality means, what we're looking at is understanding where streams are going to flow year round, because that's going to impact some of our practice placement. But again, that's a conversation that the conservation professional would want to have with the GIS technician. Okay, and Becky put a comment in. So we have experienced maps for three reporters. I see wetlands and wetland buffers located around county roads and farm sets. I'm thinking because they did not do the hydro modifications. Yes, exactly, Becky. That is 100% correct. And we're going to come back to that, and I have some more examples of that. So the hydro modification is incredibly important um, for understanding practice placement and where practices end up going. And one of those practices is wetlands. So that's a great point, Becky. I just want to say kudos to you on that. And wow, we have someone putting images in the chat. I love it. So, all right, you might have to help me with your name. I'm going to try Nazmul. And if I've said it incorrectly, please feel welcome to come off mute and correct how I've said it. But you've done a great job identifying where some of those hydro modifications should occur. Philip seconds that, and I just want to say kudos to both of you. So those red circles, those are two excellent locations where hydro modification should occur in question number 1. In both of those locations, maybe this is something folks would put in the chat. Do we think that in those locations that are circled, would those be cut lines or dams? Would we be dropping the elevation there or increasing the elevation and impeding flow? Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah. So those locations would be places where we want to put cut lines. So we would drop the elevation to get water to flow probably underneath what is a road underneath those culverts, and correct the elevation model. Becky already alluded to this in her chat message, but one thing I want to highlight here is just the importance of turning on those road layers if you're the analyst who's doing this work or encouraging the analyst who's doing this work, turning on things like roads, railroads, and then in states again where there's infrastructure layers around culverts, that will really help this part of the process. It will go faster and it will result in more accurate understanding of where water's flowing on the landscape. So before we move on to thinking about streams, I want to just pause and ask, what questions do folks have sort of given this sort of high level view of DEM prep and hydro modification before we move on? Okay, so next question is about streams. And so if you look at that image on the lower part of the page, again, just orient yourself with the blue being the perennial stream reach. So in the way we were thinking about this, this would be part of the reach that flows all of the time. And then those little yellow fingers that are coming off, those are flow paths. So in this case, the analyst has made a mistake. And so you've corrected them, but where that yellow line is, where that red arrow, they thought that was probably perennial. So if you hadn't made that correction, can you put in the chat what other tools might be impacted down the road? So if you hadn't corrected that, what might be impacted? Okay, so yeah, Ryan's got the catch-all. I love it. Yes. So tools 3 through 7 would certainly be impacted. I'm going to really say that tools probably 4, 5, and 6 would be the tools that would be most impacted. So just kind of thinking through some of the tools. So for example, if we think about tools that rely on some of that understanding about whether it's perennial or not, so riparian and saturated buffers, they're only going to get cited on what we've denoted as perennial stream reaches. So those riparian and saturated buffers, the way the ACPF runs, they're not going to get placed on ephemeral or intermittent flow paths. So the only candidate locations are going to be on those perennial stream reaches. Things like nutrient removal wetlands and WASCABs or water and sediment control basins, they cannot intersect with the perennial stream reach, but they must intersect with a flow path, so something like an ephemeral stream. So again, by getting the perennial versus ephemeral right, or I guess by delineating perennial versus ephemeral, you're going to impact what can be cited on a perennial stream versus a flow path. The other thing I'll just mention is that for identifying depressions on the landscape, so that's in toolbox number 4. Those depressions can't be identified along those perennial stream reaches, only ephemeral. And so that could have implications for conservation practices like underground outlets or wetland restoration. So again, just there are consequences down the line in terms of decision making for practices that are really important to think through at this stage. Okay, I've got several questions in here, so I'm gonna just run through and make sure I've responded to those. Okay, so again, if I pronounce your name incorrectly, please unmute yourself and correct me. Betrit, so Marcel has responded, but you add ACPF Toolbox from the ACPF for Watersheds.org website. It adds into ARC Pro just like any other toolbox. So that should take care of that. Brian, for the first practice question, this seems like, is that something you would correct at this stage? Okay, let me orient myself. Yes, you could very much correct that at this stage. And I think if you look at so I'm gonna like totally spoiler alert, encourage you not if you haven't. Please don't scroll down, but the answers are there. So if you scroll all the way to the bottom, we've provided you with the answers or sort of like our best interpretation of the answers. So what you'll see for question 1 is that the 2 locations that were identified in the chat are 100% locations where we'd want to hydromodify, but that there are other locations too, namely up in that upper channel. There are a couple locations where there would be cut lines that would straighten out. And Brian, I don't think we've identified the one that you've specifically zoomed in on, but this would be the stage to make all of those corrections. So anything that you feel like isn't an accurate representation of where water's flowing, now would be the time to modify the digital elevation model. Okay. All right. I think I've gotten everybody. Okay, what questions do we have before we move on to thinking about identifying field characteristics and potential resource concerns? All right, so I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to run through a couple more slides. Okay. So Becky, before I do this is a great question. So Becky asks, how do you know how far to quote unquote cut? Okay, so this is a question that we have talked about a lot. And it's funny, is Josh Obrecht going to join at some point, ACPF team? At any rate,
Not,
go ahead,
not,
Marcel.
not today, but he will be here
Okay.
Wednesday and Friday.
Okay, so my colleague, Josh Obrecht and I have laughed about this a lot. A lot of this is qualitative and subjective. So it's really up to the discretion of the analyst about how far you want to cut. And I laugh because Josh and I have very different cutting culture. And so my cuts tend to really focus on ensuring that the perennial stream network, so that stream network that's we intend to be flowing year round, and um, the stream network that is along roads, along railroads, around infrastructure. I do almost 100% of my modification in those areas. I tend to make very little change in fields, for example, sort of in the middle of things, I guess. And so my process is really trying to get water to flow down, especially with respect to the perennial stream network and the flow paths adjacent to infrastructure. Josh is much more committed than I am, and he really tries to correct the whole thing. Um, and so I think it is subjective. There are certainly points at which you want to continue to make changes, but there does come a point where it's probably going to be imperfect, but it's going to get you where you need to go. And that's kind of a learning process. And I think it's an iterative process for that very reason. So, um, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll go through that first DEM prep toolbox. I'll do cut lines, I'll do dam lines, and then I'll run the next step and look at what the flow paths look like. And then I'll spend some time kind of cruising along through each one of this. Basically, I do it section by section. And then I just read across and then down, read across and then down, read across and then down. And then when I feel like, I have sufficiently addressed all that I can see, then I move on and run it again. But it really is an iterative process that takes time. That's a great question, Becky. And I'm sorry to not have like a very definitive answer of like, after this long, you're ready to go, or we have a tool that like checks for you. It's a subjective process. Other questions that folks might have before we move on? These have been great so far. Okay, so Hannah Porter. So is it good practice to rerun the tool after? Yes, it is 100% good practice. So, like I said, for step one, the DEM preparation, a lot of times when I get to that last step and I've made my cuts in my dams, then I'll move forward. So I'll characterize the stream. And then I'll go back through. And if water isn't flowing where I would expect it to flow, if I look at the hillshade, if I look at the aerial imagery, if I turn on those road and culvert layers, those railroads, and water is doing things I don't expect it to do, and the local conservation professional also feels like water is moving in places it shouldn't be moving, then I'll go back and make either more cuts or correct my cuts or more dams or correct my dams. I would say on average, it really depends on the watershed and how much infrastructure there is. But that, I can do it like three to five times is not unusual for me to kind of go back and forth and make some corrections. And again, I think, if you're the analyst who's doing it, it's probably going to take the analyst between 6 and, I don't know, 10, 20 hours to do this. So it really does take a lot of time. But this step is the most important. And once it's done, it's done. But it's a really critical step. What other questions do we have before we move forward? All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to move on to field characterization. And what I have to share about field characterization is actually pretty quick, so I don't think it'll take us terribly long. Okay. So I'm going to resituate us in terms of the toolbox. So this would be the point where you've done DEM preparation, and you have your stream networks and catchments delineated. And so now you're moving on to characterize the resources specifically related to tile drainage and runoff that could occur in the fields in the watershed. So again, the goal of step number 3 is to really understand where those resource concerns might exist within the watershed, mostly at the field scale. So this is the result, one of the results of the first step in field characterization. So the first thing that the GIS technician is going to do is look at by-field slope statistics. There are 2 different ways of looking at slope, sort of the classic GIS approach of slope statistics and then using surface parameters. My preference is to use surface parameters. The analyst will likely choose one or the other, and to be honest, it doesn't matter a whole lot. The outputs are going to inform slope at the field scale. So this is a map. This is that same watershed, and so what you're looking at here is our mean slopes that are going to follow soil unit classification. So gray 0 to 2 up to this really dark color of 12 to 25% slope. This particular watershed is relatively flat. It's on the Des Moines Lobe in central Iowa. So really the only elevation that you're seeing is right along that perennial stream reach. And I just want to show, so the visualization is really useful, and I think it can help to direct where there might be areas of concern. So for example, in some of these slopes down in the southern part of this watershed, we are getting toward that 12-25% mean. And so those might be areas where we would invest in some time looking at versus some of the slopes out on the plain where some practices might not be suitable and the resource concerns might be different. So the visualization, I think, is really useful in sort of seeing it. The tabular data that are hosted behind the map are also really important. So for each one of these fields in this watershed, so that's what you're seeing in row 3 here, is that each of those fields has its own identification number. And then for each one of those fields, you can see the mean slope, the slope of 75%, and then you can start to see the percent of the field that's in each one of these slope classes. So the percent less than 1%, 1 to 2, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and over 15. So you can start to understand the slope tendencies and the slope characteristics of each individual field. So perhaps mean isn't the most useful information that you're looking at. Maybe what you're trying to understand is the largest proportion of the field that lies within any one of these slopes. So you can sort it all kinds of ways, but this is one of the key outputs. The other piece of information that I think is useful is tile drainage. Tile drainage, particularly in the upper Midwest, is really useful for understanding potential nitrate leaching. And so there is a tool that we've developed that's based on the soils data. So this isn't based on physical actual drainage. It's based on the probability that there's drainage in these fields, given the soil characteristics that are present. And so these green locations, those are locations that are adjacent to the stream network. In those locations, it's likely that there's quite a bit of slope and that the soils adjacent to that stream network aren't going to be those really heavy clays where we might see ponding and ultimately tile drainage. So in this watershed, again, we're in central Iowa, so much of it is tile drained and could inform areas again to prioritize for differential conservation. And again, the tabular data behind that, thinking about the percent of the field that's hydric, that has a dual drainage classification, where there's a high water table that has poor drainage. Those are all characteristics that you'd want to look at when you're thinking about drainage. The GIS technician does have to make some choices when we think about tile drainage. And I would encourage you that as you're going about this step, if you're not the person who's doing the GIS analysis, that you'd want to have a conversation about what kind of characteristics would lead you to believe that a field is tile drained in your particular watershed. So really having a chat about that would be a critical step. Okay, the last part I want to, okay, hold on just a second. I see a chat. Okay, so Betchert asks, where do I get maps with tile drainage lines? And do they contain all the tile drainage networks available? I'm assuming that's what TDN is, but I'm not 100% sure. So I believe that this differs quite extensively by state. In many states, there are not maps of tile drainage lines. So at least not in a publicly available, easily accessible way. And so the way that ACPF overcomes that is just evaluating essentially the probability that there's tile drainage in the field based only on the soils layer. So I'm going to go back one slide. So what you're looking at in this map of drained fields, it's all just probability. So what we're saying here is based on the hydric nature of the field, based on its dual drainage classification, and based on the slope, we would either expect or not expect tile drainage to occur. And we could certainly be wrong. I have been wrong about tile drainage here. So this would be something that you'd certainly want to have a chat with about the landowner. It's just a probability. Becky, if you're working with producers, is there a place to enter? Yes. Okay, Becky, that's a great question. So if you're working with producers and you know a field is tile or is not tiled, one way you can basically edit that is by changing the attribute table. So I just showed you this, this tabular data that's stored with these fields. This is editable. So if, for example, let's say you knew the landowner from field number 1 and field number 2, and the model that we're using is saying that field's not tile drained, but it is, you can just go in here and edit that to say yes. And then for the rest of the GIS process, for example, when we're considering practice placement, that will say yes, and that field will be considered drained. So you can manually basically force drained versus undrained. And so if you have some knowledge, you or the GIS analyst could go in and edit the attribute table to correct for that. That's a great question. Okay. Okay, and Kevin is pointing Betchert to a workshop on how to find tile drainage, and that's fantastic. I do imagine this is like Emily speaking, not like any reputable science, but I think that over time, as we advance our understanding of satellite data and AI, that we'll start to see much more realistic tile maps come through. But in a lot of places, we're not there yet. Okay. All right. So the last step of field characterization is to understand runoff risk assessment. So basically what we're trying to do in step 3 is to say, where are areas where we might be concerned about nitrate leaching because of tile drainage, and where are there places where we might be concerned about phosphorus loss and runoff risk because of slope and proximity to stream. So one of the ways that we do that is by this runoff risk assessment. It's a really straightforward process. Essentially, there's a matrix. On one side of the matrix is the slope steepness of the field, and on the other side is its proximity to the stream. And if the slope is very steep and it's very close to the stream, then it gets this A qualitative mark, and what that corresponds to is a very high runoff risk, which you see in the map on the right side of the screen, versus a field that's very far away from the stream where slope is very low, which you see some of those gray areas, very far from the stream, very flat. And so the idea, again, here, similar to the nitrate leaching, is to think about where are those areas where we might be able to prioritize or really increase our resource capacity. So if we're thinking about runoff risk, those might be those areas closest to the stream network here. Those are also going to be the same places where we're going to see practices that are appropriate for mitigating runoff risk. So this really helps us to understand where those practices might be, and then again, how to potentially prioritize resources. So coming out of this third toolbox, the things I want to make sure we walk away with this from is that this third step can inform where resource concerns may exist, specifically with respect to nitrate leaching from tile drainage and runoff and phosphorus and sediment loss in areas that have steep slopes that are close to the stream. These data are really meant to assist folks in thinking about what those resource concerns might be and preparing for conversations with landowners or preparing for site visits. This information needs field validation. So it means, to Becky's point, it means talking to landowners. Is your field tile drained? What kind of tile pattern do you have? Do you think that there's, have you experienced or have you seen sediment loss with precipitation events? Asking those questions to sort of confirm or to understand what the model is saying is a really important step. So just want to emphasize the importance of getting out there and talking to landowners and really using this information to sort of prepare and to expect things. All right, so we're going to do questions 3 and 4 in the practice worksheet. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to ask to we're going to kind of do the same process. So I'm going to give you about 7 minutes to do those 2 questions, and then we're going to come back together as a group, and I'm going to ask you to put some stuff in the chat. So questions 3 and 4, and we'll come back together at in about 7 minutes.
Do you want to put those on the screen, Emily, and do a quick screen share?
Yeah, I can share the PDF that everyone's looking at. Just a sec. All right, so I'm gonna bring us back together, and we're gonna start by looking at question number 3, which asks, how does the ACPF decide where there is tile drainage? Um, and so again, just to orient yourself, when you're looking at the map, the blue is no, the red is yes, and the yellow is non-agricultural. And so, first question I would like folks to answer in the chat. Does this map show where tile drainage is located? So, yes, if it shows where tile drainage is located, no, if it doesn't show where tile drainage is located. So, go ahead and pop your responses in the chat. All right, so I'm getting several no's. And those first brave souls of putting no in there, you are correct. So this map doesn't show where tile drainage is, right? To Sarah Benton's point, it shows fields that likely have tile drainage or fields that don't likely have tile drainage. So it's that probability factor, right? It's not yes or no, it's where we think it is. And this would be an important point to have conversations with landowners. All right, so question B in the chat. What inputs are used to run this tool and make this map? So what kind of inputs are required to make this map? What's the probability based on? How is ACPF indicating yes, it's probably or no, it's probably not? All right, I'm seeing the critical factors. Yeah, great. Okay. So, Ryan summarized it really nicely, and Becky and Nazmul and Sarah, you got it right too. So, the really critical piece here is the soils data. So, the soils data is going to inform areas where we would expect there to be hydric, we would expect to be hydric, where we might see frequent ponding, soils that would have a dual drainage classification, which would indicate a likelihood of tiling. So we're looking for that information from the soils table. And then we're also looking for fields that have a relatively low slope. So fields that would be low relief, where we wouldn't expect that water to otherwise drain off. And then finally, the fields data, right? So we're characterizing tile drained or not tile drained by field. So we need to have those field boundaries as part of the input data. Okay, last question I'm going to ask you to put in the chat. What later tools rely on the drainage table output? So basically, like, why is it important to understand where there's tile drainage when we think about conservation practices? What practices rely on tile drainage? Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Okay, practice. Yeah, exactly, Becky. Practice placement. What kind of practices would it matter to know about tile drainage? Okay, so, yeah, great. So Katie said runoff and flood control. Absolutely. Um, Brianne says grassed waterways. Renee says nitrogen management. Yeah, all of those things are especially, I want to just emphasize, Renee, you're right on track there, and same with Katie and Brianne, but really thinking about how do we manage for nitrate leaching and nitrate loss, particularly in those drained landscapes. And understanding that can inform practices like bioreactors, like saturated buffers, like wetlands. We really want to think about how we can maximize the use of those practices in fields that are tile drained. And so some of those practices like bioreactors, ACPF is only going to identify opportunities for bioreactors in fields that are tile drained. So having that tile drainage understanding is really, really critical. All right. We're going to move on. Question number 4. So what you're looking at here is a runoff risk map, and it's one of the most used outputs in ACPF. And so the first question is, what two factors are used to identify the runoff risk for fields? So what two factors are accounted for when we think about runoff risk? Yeah, okay, great. So I see them coming in already. Slope and distance to stream. That is those two are really, really key for ACPF. I want to just highlight Renee's response about soil type. Soil type is also important, and it's not included in how ACPF characterizes runoff risk. So that would be an important thing to consider when you're trying to understand the results of ACPF and what they can and can't inform. And then part B, it's really how could this be useful to a conservation planner? And I think this really harkens back to some of the responses that we got for nitrogen, which are things like water management, things like phosphorus management, things like sediment load management, particularly when we get adjacent to these streams. So this particular stream is located in central Iowa. It's not a cold water stream. It's not a trout stream, but certainly thinking about that in the context of those types of streams might be really important. So, so that's sort of the context there. All right. So before we move on to the last, I'm going to cluster together steps 4, 5, and 6 because they're all about conservation practice opportunities. Before we move on to that, any questions about field characterization that I haven't yet answered? All right. So this is the last these are the last steps that I'm going to talk through. And I think these are probably the steps that most people are the most interested in. But as the person who's giving the overview of the technical details of the toolbox, I really want to make sure I linger on the terrain processing and the development of the stream network and catchments, because those are really going to set us up for success here. So steps 4, 5, and 6, we're going to characterize opportunities for conservation practices at the subfield, field, and watershed scale. Marcel already showed the conceptual pyramid that's associated with ACPF, where the tool is really sort of the pyramid relies on building soil health, but then recognizes that that's often not enough. And to really address nutrient and sediment loss, we need to control water within fields, below fields, and in the riparian area. So these are the practices that ACPF offers in the toolbox. So for our control within fields, it's grassed waterways, contour or prairie buffer strips, bioreactors, and drainage water management. At the below field position, it's water and sediment control basins or WASCOBs, nutrient removal wetlands, and farm ponds. And then in the riparian area, the ACPF characterizes both riparian and saturated buffers, as well as two-stage ditches. So these are sort of this is the menu of practices that ACPF covers. And presently there are 10 included in the toolbox. And so I am going to step through just two potential tools that you could use just to give folks a feel and a flavor for the technical details that go behind the visualization of these practices in fields and in watersheds. Essentially, this is the framework that all of these practices are going to follow. So I chose contour buffer strips and nutrient removal wetlands just to demonstrate that in-field and below-field capacity. But really, again, the framework for how ACPF works through identifying these opportunities is going to be very similar for all of the practices that I showed. So contour buffer strips, they're associated with the Conservation Practice Standard 332. And the goal is, remember, to decrease slope length, intercept runoff, and primarily reduce phosphorus and sediment that are occurring from overland flow. All of the conservation practices and the parameters and the processing that ACPF is doing is built upon the conservation practice standards. So where we're citing these locations on the landscape, where they're being identified, directly aligns with what's outlined by the NRCS. The data inputs for the contour buffer strips We need field boundaries, the slope raster in the table, the digital elevation model, and the flow accumulation raster. The reason why I want to highlight this as a technical detail is because what you'll see is that there are two data inputs that are coming from that DEM preparation and that terrain analysis. So again, those steps are incredibly important in order to get quality data out about where practice placement is occurring. You'll also see that field characterization is showing up with respect to that slope raster and that slope table. So again, all these steps sort of build on each other, and the integrity of each also builds. In this particular case, there's two decisions that the user has to make. The first is not really a decision. You just need to input the vertical conversion. So in the case of a DEM, that's meters. You need to convert to your vertical elevation. The user decision that isn't the one that is important for practitioners is buffer width. So you can put in different buffer widths dependent on your watershed and your scenario. So the general process is going to reflect the NRCS conservation practice standard. So in this case, what we do is in that watershed, we identify areas of the watershed that are in agriculture. So in this case, row crops that have a slope of between 4 and 15%. And then once we've identified all those areas, we go through a process to basically smooth that landscape. So there's not sort of little holes, but basically identify all those candidate areas. And then we generate contours within those areas so that we're getting the spacing equivalent of NRCS recommended standards. So in this case, we use the third quartile slope value of each field. So I just, again, want to highlight the inputs, the process builds on each other. It's really important that we get those inputs correct. And then the process and the data are going to mirror that included in the conservation practice standard. And so this is what the output looks like. So what you can see on the left, that's a whole HUC 12 watershed. This is in Webster County in Iowa. And you can see the smattering of these orange squigglies. Those are contour buffer strips in different parts of the watershed where slope in this case is greater. The green overlay here, those are row crop fields, and the yellow fields are pasture. And in this case, for contour buffer strips, we exclude pasture. This is a zoomed in version of that. So same land use coloration, green row crop, yellow pasture, gray non-agricultural, but the hill shade is turned on. So you can actually start to see where some of those contours are happening. And so my favorite one is this one where my cursor is in the lower right-hand corner of the zoomed in image, where you can actually see sort of that spine and the contours that are forming around it to slow down, to disrupt that slope length and thus slow down runoff loss. Behind this contour buffer strip table is a tabular data or attribute data about the size and the length of each one of these contour buffer strips. So that would give you potential estimations about contractors, materials, costs, things like that. The second practice I want to highlight in a similar vein is the nutrient removal wetlands tool. So this tool is intended to align with conservation practice standards like 656 and 658, really wetlands that are adapted for nitrate reduction, water storage, and also wildlife potential in some cases. Again, if we look at the inputs required to run this tool, 3 of the initial inputs, the digital elevation model, the flow direction, the flow accumulation, are going to come from that DEM preparation step. The watershed boundary is an input layer that you're provided, and then that stream reach that you've created that's coming from the second step of the toolbox. The default and optional parameters for nutrient removal wetlands, these are all going to, again, align with NRCS conservation practice standards. The drainage range is, there's not editing optional for an analyst in this case. It has to be greater than 60 hectares. And then the user can make decisions about spacing, impoundment height, and buffer height based on the landscape that you're in. So there is some discretion here. And again, this would be an important conversation between the conservation professional and the GIS analyst. Um, you can also optionally include layers about water bodies and roads here. That's often helpful just so that we're not citing nutrient removal wetlands over existent water bodies or roads. So the process here is that all suitable locations are going to be identified along flow paths with the threshold drainage area. And then there are points that are generated along that flow path, and then wetlands are simulated. And the idea is that the wetland has to meet the suitability criteria, so fall within the pooled versus drainage area ratios and the buffer versus pooled area ratios. So the outputs from this process are nutrient removal wetlands and then their drainage areas. One thing I want to point out for this particular tool is that some states have and stakeholders have adapted the nutrient removal wetland to meet the wetland criteria that are in their particular state. So I know Illinois has a pretty robust nutrient removal wetland tool. Jill Costell with the Illinois Wetland Initiative or Association has done and her team have done quite a bit of work to modify this to their particular landscape. So certainly there are opportunities for modification of any of these tools, but the nutrient removal wetlands tool is one in particular that I know folks have modified. This is what it looks like at the watershed scale. One reason I like to show this is because you can see the impact of roads so clearly. And I think it's so important that you include roads as you're making decisions about wetlands, and then also that there's time and space to go back through and think about corrections that might need to be made given the influence of roads that we might see. The other thing I'll just throw up here is the attribute table or the tabular data associated with wetlands that gets generated. So for each wetland location, so if we look at the site ID, this is wetland number 293. There's a wetland portion, so that's the pool, and then there's a buffer portion of that wetland. Those are going to have the same contributing area. You can see the pool acreage here and the buffer acreage here. And then the information about the bank height, the bank elevation, and then the pool storage versus the variable storage. So that gets at questions around potential water storage associated with putting things like wetlands onto the landscape. All right, I'm going to pause and look at the question. All right. Okay, so Mitch asked 2 questions. Okay, so first, contour strip size and length is reported. Does size refer to width? Yeah, so that's a great question. So what you'll get is the length, and you'll also get the area. So you set the width of the contour buffer strip. So the width is a piece of input information. So you would put that within, and then in the tabular data, you'll see the length of the contour buffer strip as well as the area. So that's a great question. And then are nutrient removal wetland locations only identified along ephemeral flow paths? Yes, that's correct. So nutrient removal wetland locations in the ACPF are only going to be identified along those flow paths. So they're not going to be identified along perennial, so always flowing streams, and they're also not going to be identified in areas where a flow path is absent or we don't have a flow path. That's a great question. All right, so in terms of takeaways for steps 4, 5, and 6, I think the things I really want to emphasize is that the results or the outputs from the process provide both a visualization of where the practices might be and also a wealth of tabular data about those practices. So like I showed with the wetland information, you can see where those wetlands are in the landscape, but you can also understand things like pool storage or variable storage from those particular practices. And that the process by which we identify the opportunities for conservation practices, they're based on the biophysical input data and the data generated during prior steps of the ACPF, and the conservation practice standards. So it's a really data-driven approach to really identifying where those opportunities are. These results are not prescriptive, so the intent here is to offer menus of opportunities to interested landowners and to really have conversations about all of the potential conservation opportunities. Well, not all, but a number of different conservation opportunities for farms, fields, and watersheds. And then, as always, I think it's important to just, this is a model, this is spatial data. We think this model is particularly useful, but all models are wrong. We hope that most models are useful. And again, I think this one is, but it doesn't diminish the need for a conservation professional to visit and assess the site in person to really understand the fit of the location and alignment with landowner objectives. So again, having that really local touch point is a critical step in the process. All right. So, I'm gonna move to working through some questions as the last part of our time together today. I don't think we'll get through all of them, and it might really be just time for you to kind of think through and ask questions. But before I do that, I just want to, really wrap up by we're gonna go back and use the worksheet. But I do want to just start to hopefully have folks thinking about if you could envision using this in your conservation planning process, sort of what steps could, the tool be used for? How could it fit? So just want to have that question sort of lingering, especially between now and tomorrow when you come back. So I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint. And before I move us over to the worksheet, I want to just pause and ask what questions there are about steps 4, 5, and 6. Where we're actually identifying opportunities for conservation practices. All right, well, in the interest of time, I want to leave Marcel a little bit of time at the end. So I think what I'm going to suggest is that if folks want to start by just looking at question number 5, I'll give you about 4 minutes to look at question number 5. And then, and I'll share my screen so you can see that. And then we'll move up. I'll hand it back to Marcel.
Marcel, there was a question in the chat about the PowerPoint from today.
Yes, the PowerPoint. Yeah, Emily, were you going to share that? And we'll put it in the session 1 folder that's in the shared folder that you have.
right, so I'm gonna bring us back together for question number 5, which was about water storage, and specifically thinking through what key differences are there between depressions, wetlands, um, farm ponds, and water and sediment control basins. So all of these are identified at some point in ACPF, and so really thinking through what differences, what does that mean is important. So one of those key differences you can actually see in this map on the screen. So in the chat, what's one of the key differences between where depressions are located versus where nutrient removal wetlands are located? And you can actually see this difference in the map. Yeah, okay, Mitch and Becky, great. Yeah, so and Keaton, yeah. So if you look at where we're thinking about nutrient removal wetlands and where those can go, those are always going to be intersected with an ephemeral stream or an ephemeral flow path. So that nutrient removal wetland, it's always going to be along that flow path. Versus a depression, those are going to be out on the landscape. So you can see that in that lighter blue color. Some of those are going to be closed depressions. Well, all of them are in this case are going to be closed depressions. They're not going to be connected to that flow path. And those two opportunities are going to offer very variable water storage, right? So that's an important piece. So in the interest of time, what I want to do is I want to just encourage you to take some time to look at questions 6, 7, and 8. They're going to step through other conservation practices. So question 6 is really using grassed waterways as an effort to try to help folks understand that you can make changes in some of the parameters in the ACPF to either concentrate, for example, grassed waterways, so see more of their potential opportunities on the landscape, or less. And there are similar processes for other practices. So you can make adjustments to really see what you want to see for practice potential. Question 7 is about bioreactors and some of the assumptions around siting bioreactors. I think it's important to ask assumptions for not only bioreactors, but other practices as well. So this is a question that gets at some of the things that we're assuming. And then question 8 is about riparian function. So the last tool in the toolbox is about riparian practices. And so this question really gets at some of those practices. I want to remind folks as we leave that there are answers to these questions at the end of this document. So just going back to the question that we were just focused on about depressions. So remember we talked about this, but those depressions are closed, they collect water, and they lack a flow path that would drain the area, where nutrient removal wetlands, farm ponds, and wascobs, those are going to be identified along flow paths, either that are often ephemeral or intermittent, excluding that perennial stream reach. And then the other key piece is that the drainage areas above farm ponds versus nutrient removal wetlands or wascobs, they're going to be different, and there are going to be different practice placements based on those drainage areas. So wetlands greater than 150 acres for drainage, and wascobs just 2 to 50 acres. So those wascobs tend to be quite a bit smaller. So just really thinking about the situation that results in each one of those practices. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing. And maybe if there are any sort of in the last 3 minutes before I turn it back over to Marcel, what questions do folks have as I sort of wrap up on the technical side today?
Can I use my microphone?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's 100% okay. Please do.
So I appreciate the binary classification of ephemeral and perennial for multiple reasons, but that's not reality. In the guide, it does mention intermittent streams. Does the programmatic side of ACPF or policy drive that binary division of perennial and ephemeral? And or how do you deal with intermittent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think well, I guess a couple of responses. So you're right, in the user manual, you can discern as many categories for these streams as you find useful. So certainly ephemeral, intermittent, perennial, but you could delineate others as you wish. Pragmatically or sort of programmatically to ACPF, that delineation of perennial, ephemeral, intermittent is going to result in different practice opportunities being identified along those flow paths. So that's a consequence that you'll want to consider like as you move forward. If you're an analyst or you have an analyst who feels really comfortable in Python, you can certainly edit the codes, the Python code for some of those tools to consider more than just, for example, perennial, or to not exclude perennial. So there is flexibility in the code. It's all publicly available. But I think, largely it was just the result of us trying to simplify to meet the conservation practice standard for these different practices. But certainly agree with you, Mitch, that there is a lot of gray area, and that flexibility might be really important to accomplish the goals that you might have. And so if we can help with some of that, please reach out. I mean, that's a great question, and I think, deserves a good conversation. And I guess related to that, should I put the hub contact information in the chat? I feel like for questions that could be really useful. I'll pop in the hub if folks have questions or need some more help as well.
That'd be great. And Ann Nardi will talk about the hub on Friday too. So. All right. Well, getting ready for Wednesday. Take a look at your agenda. There's a link in there to get to the use examples, the ACPF use examples. Please look at those ahead of Wednesday. We'll have a panel of ACPF users, but they're not going to give extended presentations. So we're assuming you've watched some of their videos ahead of time. And we won't go the full 2 hours on Wednesday, so you can consider that time your time to look at those videos ahead of time. Also, take a look. You can submit any more questions that you have for Emily or others about what you've been hearing. Certainly send that in. That link too is in your agenda or on following this QR code. And what else was I going to say? I think that's about it. And then be thinking about the question Emily asked of which of these tools are most useful to you and how can you fit them into your conservation planning? Any other comments or questions? Thank you all. I really appreciate all of your participation. Wait, where is in the chat here? I'm missing a few. And posted the demographic survey again. So if you didn't do that at the beginning, please fill that out for us. All right. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Emily, so much for your presentation and engagement.